BPL, DG sir has joined.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Please continue. Please, yes, please proceed. All the best.
Thank you, sir. A very good afternoon to all present here. I am Sharmishta Sharma, a fourth year BLLB student, and I welcome you all to the webinar on gender sensitivity and the judiciary in India. Is it necessary for administration of justice? Being organized by DME Law School. Today, we have with us as chief guest Professor Dr. V.S. Elizabeth, ma'am, Vice Chancellor, Tamil Nadu National Law University, who has taken time off her busy schedule to deliver this lecture for us. We welcome you, ma'am. Today, I would also like to extend a warm welcome to Honorable Mr. Justice Bhava Singh, sir, Director General, Delhi Metropolitan Education, Noida, and former judge, Allahabad High Court, who is the guiding light for all of us. I further welcome Professor Dr. Ravikant Swami, sir, Director DME, and Professor Dr. Bhavesh Gupta, sir, Head of Academics, DME Law School, to the event. I welcome all the participants, and I'm sure that today's event will help everyone present here in enriching their experience and gaining valuable knowledge on the theme. No institution can run without the presence of a great leader, and we are privileged to have our Director General, Honorable Mr. Justice Bhava Singh, sir, with us. From his appointment in 1970, His Lordship has had a very illustrious career and has graced the office of the Judge of Special Court of CBI, the Registrar General, Supreme Court of India, and the Judge of Allahabad High Court. He was the part of the bench that heard matters of the historic judgment related to Ayodhya decision. Sir has always been with us, guiding and showing us the right path, and is an inspiration to all of us. I would request respected Director General, sir, to kindly introduce the epitome of legal fraternity, Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer, in whose memory we conduct this lecture series. Please, sir.
Thank you. God bless you. Madam Elizabeth, the chief guest of today's event, Director DME, Mr. Aman Sahni, the Vice Chairman of the Sunshine Educational Society, faculty members, and dear students. It gives me an immense pleasure to introduce Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer, who was a judge yet to be born, not only in India, but if I say a judge of his caliber, his intelligence, his experience, his vision has not yet born even across the world. Friends, he was born in Thalassery, Kerala, and his father wanted him to be a journalist, but he preferred to be an advocate, and he practiced initially under the care of his own father, Mr. V.V. Ramal Iyer, who was also a famous lawyer of those days. Very soon, Mr. V.R. Krishna Iyer picked up his practice, and he became very popular amongst the peasants and dockyard laborers. And he was so endeared by them that they persuaded him to contest the first election of 1952, and he got elected, and he was appointed minister in the first government of Mr. Nambudripad. He was appointed law minister, and he had many portfolios, including home, prison, etc. He always believed in reforms, and he introduced many reforms in the jail, and reformed the conditions of the prisoners. After his term as minister was over, he resumed his practice and also shifted to High Court in Cochin. And from there, in due course of time, he was appointed as a High Court judge. And barely he was a judge of 5 years. Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister, came to know that here was a judge who believed in social reforms. Then he was appointed as member of the chairman of the Law Commission. And from there, he was elevated as a judge of the Supreme Court. In Supreme Court, he delivered classic judgments on civil and criminal side both. His judgments in Shamsher Singh case, which interpreted the powers of the cabinet vis-a-vis president, Menka Gandhi case, and Ratlam municipality case, and above all, Miss Muthamma's case, who was an IFS officer and who was denied promotion to the highest grade of the service. And since she would not have been eligible to be in that grade, she would not have been appointed as ambassador in any country. Then she filed a petition, which was heard by Justice Krishna Iyer, who expressed his shock, rather judicial indignation, and wondered whether he was living in a country, the constitution of which had a provision for equality under Article 14. Relying upon it and saying the rule to be as anti-women, he declared it unconstitutional, as a result of which Muthamma was promoted to the highest grade and then appointed as ambassadors not in one but many countries of the world. And she had a very distinguished career. Had Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer not heard her case, perhaps she would have been deprived of her distinguished career. Friends, he was also known for banning the handcuffing. Perhaps the young generation may not know, because handcuffing of the prisoners under trials is not in vogue in India, unless there are exceptional cases of terrorists, etc. So, and declaration of banning the handcuffing, the critics said that he was brought to the category of Lord Denning, and he also encouraged the public interest litigation and decided many cases, including Ratlam municipality case. And he also wrote many books and also got published his travelogues. Friends, he on his retirement was admired by the bar and bench, and Mr. L.M. Singhvi, a senior advocate of the Supreme Court, the father of Manu Singhvi, a political leader who is in light and who is in limelight these days because of a senior congressman, said that Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer opened the door of the downtrodden through public interest litigation. He will be known for his contribution. Justice A.S. Anand, who was the Chief Justice, who subsequently became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said that Justice Krishna Iyer was the Bhisham Pitameh of Indian judiciary. Bail not jail is the right of the accused, was said by Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer. In his childhood, when he was a student of the primary school as well as the high school, he saw poor boys not performing well in the school. And it was because of their poverty. It ignited in him the respect for the poor people and also inspired him to work for the poor so that the lot of the poor people can be improved. He also propagated that poverty should be abolished from our country. Friends, during his minister days, Justice Mr. Nambudripad, the Chief Minister, asked him to arrest a particular section of the society following some riots in the state of Kerala. But he was not a yes minister, though he knew that he could be removed from the post of minister. But he did not obey the chief minister because he was not against the interest of justice, the reasonableness, and the social equality. He pleaded with the chief minister that why the innocent people should be arrested. Though he lost the charge of the home ministry, nevertheless, he would never compromise with his principles. A great judge. Friends, he was not in favor of judges appointing judges, meaning thereby the collegium system, because he saw the collegium system suffering from many vices. Anyway, if it has been declared to be valid by the Supreme Court, then there is nothing to challenge it. He was in favor of appointing a performance commission so that the performance of the judges could be judged. He criticized the judges who did not believe in working day and night. Friends, I'll finish my interaction with you by reproducing one incident of his life, which he himself has shared in some of his memoirs. At the age of 11 years, Justice Krishna Iyer, who was just a lad, a primary school boy, was wading through the river in the outskirts of his village. The name of the river was Kalpathy. When he went the midstream, he started drowning. He remembered his duty and got a jump, and he survived. He had written at the age of 98, when he was, that had he not survived in that drowning incident, perhaps there would have been no Krishna Iyer as minister, as judge of the High Court, Supreme Court, member of the commission, Law Commission, and then chairman of the Kerala Law Commission. Friends, he was totally against the hanging, that is death penalty. But because the circumstances have not been prevailing favorable to his concept of abolition, we are still continuing the death penalty as the highest penalty in the criminal law. Friends, with this, with these words, I would wish you all good luck and welcome Madam Elizabeth once again to deliver a lecture in the memory of a great judge, Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer. Thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you so much, sir, for your inspirational words and your blessings for this event. I also welcome Mr. Aman Sahani, sir. And moving forward with the event, we are very honored to have with us the visionary scholar of law, Professor Dr. V.S. Elizabeth, Vice Chancellor, Tamil Nadu National Law University, as the chief guest of the event. I would now request Ms. Sri Durga T.N. Ma'am, Assistant Professor, DME Law School, to introduce the speaker. Please, ma'am.
Thank you, Sharmishta. It's our honor and privilege to have hosted Professor Dr. V.S. Elizabeth Ma'am for this Justice Krishna Iyer Memorial Lecture. Professor Dr. V.S. Elizabeth, she is a veteran academician with many years of experience. Ma'am has been associated with many reputed academic institutions in her career. Ma'am began her career as a part-time lecturer in history in a pre-university college in Bangalore. Later, she also taught in the Indira Nagar Junior College, NMKRV College for Women, and in Maharani Lakshmi Ammani College for Women. Then she joined as a faculty member of the reputed National Law School of India University, Bangalore in 1991. In her long academic career, ma'am was associated with curriculum development and research of various academic disciplines, including history, feminist jurisprudence, and women and law. Presently, ma'am is serving as the 4th Vice Chancellor of the Tamil Nadu National Law University at Trichy. Ma'am has numerous publications to her credit in the areas of gender equality, feminist jurisprudence, and justice. We welcome you, ma'am, for the event.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I invite our chief guest for the day, Professor Dr. V.S. Elizabeth, ma'am, to enlighten us on today's theme. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. A very good afternoon to one and all who are present here on this occasion. Respected Justice Mr. Banwal Singh, Director General DME, respected Dr. Ravikant Swami, Director DME, respected Professor Dr. Bhavish Gupta, Head of Academics, DME Law School, respected faculty of DME Law School, and dear students. It is indeed an honor for me to be delivering this Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer Memorial Lecture organized by the DME Law School today. As Justice Banwal Singh has just described, Justice Krishna Iyer sowed the seeds of the public interest litigation through his landmark judgment in the Mumbai Kamgar Sabha versus Mrs. Abdul Bhai, Faizullah Bhai, and others case in 1976. This represents his interest in social justice and his passion for the downtrodden. Since my concern here is about gender justice, which is an aspect of social justice, I'm grateful to Professor Bhavish Gupta for having invited me to deliver this Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer Memorial Lecture for the faculty and students of the DME Law School. Justice Krishna is well known for his very lengthy judgments. He was seen as being very verbose, but through these judgments, he sought to ensure that justice was done by whatever means available. It is this concern for social justice that set Justice Krishna Iyer apart from the other judges who have occupied the Supreme Court benches over the years. Even though he never became the Chief Justice of India, we remember him while we barely even know the names of the many Chief Justices of India who have served the Supreme Court over the last 70 years. We remember him because of the fact that it was he who gave a new meaning to the equality clause in the Constitution. Mr. Fali Nariman compares the late Justice Krishna Iyer to one of the two stars of the Saptarishi constellation, one of the two pathfinders as they are described. One, he states, was Justice Subba Rao, and the other, he writes, was Justice Krishna Iyer. He says they influenced creative judicial thinking. They lighted new, difficult, and different paths which others followed. During their time, the practice of law was very clearly against change. And that was obviously the characteristic of the judges as well. Justice Krishna Iyer was an outstanding example of a judge who in different ways influenced and altered the habits of the mind of judges. He helped to humanize the legal system. particularly in the field of criminal jurisprudence and jail reform. He extended the frontiers of the accountability of the state and its instrumentalities in their ever-expanding operation. He made other judges think through his judgments. He made it clear that a judge must have a social approach philosophy and a humane approach to legal problems. It was under his stewardship that the rights against exploitation in Article 23 were enforced and given meaning. He was fearless, as reflected through the stand he took against the then Prime Minister, Ms. Indira Gandhi, in 1975 by giving only a limited stay in that case. Justice Krishna Iyer stated that law was value loaded. And we must remember that, generally speaking, in our country, the entire fraternity of law, be it the teachers, the judicial officers, and lawyers, keep claiming that law is objective. But here is Justice Krishna Iyer himself who stated that law was value loaded. I want you to remember that statement because that is what this entire lecture this afternoon is about. His social philosophy was the mainspring of almost all his judicial dicta, founding a new school of jurisprudence, namely social jurisprudence. He would rather do justice overriding law than administer what he believed was injustice according to law. He loaded into his judgments a rich nucleus of law, politics, and common sense, and also compassion. These are all the words in which Mr. Fali Nariman describes Justice Krishna Iyer. Justice Krishna Iyer, in one of the judgments, stated that instant or early justice seems impossible without radical reorientation and systematic changes in the judicial process. And this is where I want to start my lecture from. The fact that for instant or early justice, there is need for radical reorientation and systematic changes in the judicial process. Friends, radical reorientation and systematic changes are also needed, not just in the judicial process, but in the minds of the judiciary, if gender justice is to be done in our country and the world. Because without that kind of radical reorientation and systematic changes, we can only keep dreaming about gender justice. It is already 70 years since our constitution was adopted and came into force. We can live for another 70 years and still nothing would have changed unless we have radical reorientation and systematic changes, not only in the judicial process, but more so in the minds of the judiciary. The world we inhabit is so skewed in favor of the male gender that all other genders are only second-class citizens. It is important here to remember that we do not anymore subscribe to the idea of the binary of genders, that there is a male and there is a female. We know that there is an entire spectrum of genders. Some of us conform, to the gender stereotypes of being a male or female. Very few of us, actually speaking, conform to every single description of what it is to be masculine or feminine. The majority of us are on that spectrum, be it in the way in which we dress, cut our hair, to the kind of clothes we wear, our mannerisms, and the choices we make in terms of what we want to do on a daily basis. We are on that spectrum and not in that binary. It is important to acknowledge and respect that and not keep insisting on the binary of genders, right? So in that context, it is important to understand that the world is seen through the eyes of what are called cis males. The way they perceive the world, the way they perceive the other genders is the way in which the state and the law perceive them. And therefore, while de jure, everybody is equal under the constitution and the law, de facto, there are some more equal than the others, namely those who conform to the masculine characteristics and are seen as cis males in our society. Now, this is completely in conflict with our constitution. The preamble to our constitution states that we as citizens of India, and of course, we were not there when the constitution was adopted or drafted even, the women and men who drafted our constitution were women and men with great farsightedness, and at the same time, with a deep understanding of the inequalities and the exploitation and discrimination that existed in our country at the time of independence. And therefore, the country that they envisioned, that they imagined will come into existence as a consequence of the implementation of our constitution was a country that would be based upon the principles of justice, equality, liberty, and the dignity of the individual. Not some ancient culture, not some ancient tradition, not some religion or the other. They gave us new values, values which were completely contrary to the inherited culture and tradition in this subcontinent. And that is the reason why they drafted that constitution so carefully. So having presented the goals of this constitution to be to ensure justice, liberty, equality for all citizens of India, they went on to enshrine the fundamental rights of every individual in Chapter 3 of the Constitution. Therefore, you have Article 14, 15, 17, you have Articles 21, etc. But familiar with the reality of their times, familiar with the cultural practices of their times, they incorporated Articles 15.3 and 15.4 to deal with the inequalities that existed in society. I'm not going to go into Article 15.4 because the point that I'm here on today is about gender justice. And Article 15.3 captures the means by which the constitution makers hoped that gender justice could be implemented in this country. Right? So though you have the right to equality and right against discrimination, Article 15.3 states that notwithstanding the above, the state will have the power to make any special policy or legislations in the interests of women and children. Of course, that combination of women and children is unfortunate because women does not have to be accompanied with children. But be it as it may, the point here is that Article 15.3 gives the state the power to frame policies or legislations that will enhance the status of women so that they will be able to enjoy justice, equality, liberty, and the dignity of being an individual in this wonderful country. However, what we have seen is that time and again, we come across the utter failure of the legal system to render justice to various marginalized groups who in law are citizens of India, but in fact find themselves unable to access the corridors of justice to right the wrongs inflicted on them by fellow citizens, and very often even the state itself. When judges, due to their privileged status as men, being upper caste, upper class, Hindu, and are not only insensitive, but even ignorant of the way that the majority of the citizens of India live, how does one expect them to render justice through the courts? Everyone doesn't have to experience injustice in order to understand how it affects the lives of those who day in and out suffer the consequences of belonging to the other genders, castes, and communities. All that is needed is a little sensitivity, a little empathy. These are qualities that one can acquire through right training and teaching. Failure to do so is to perpetuate inequality in the name of justice and maintaining the status quo, all from the basis of male rationality and male objectivity. Now, it is important to understand that law does not spring out of a social vacuum. I mean, just look at the composition of the Supreme Court of India. Out of 34 judges, 34 sanctioned strength of the judges of the Supreme Court, only 2 were women. Out of a sanctioned strength of 1,113 judges in the high courts and the Supreme Court, only 80 women judges are there. Thus, only 7.2% of the number of judges in the high courts are women, while the 6 high courts of Manipur, Meghalaya, Patna, Tripura, Telangana, and Uttarakhand have no sitting women judges at all. These are the facts presented by the top law officer, the Attorney General of India, while responding to a request from the Supreme Court to assist it in a case from the Madhya Pradesh High Court, which I will discuss a little later. Mr. Venugopal said that judges need to be trained to place themselves in the shoes of the victims or survivors of sexual violence while passing orders. He also said that more women judges in constitutional courts would certainly improve gender sensitivity in the judiciary. While I don't entirely agree with that, because women too imbibe patriarchal values and can be as insensitive and unjust as male judges. In fact, you may have a more sensitive male judge than you might have a woman judge. But having more women judges would definitely make the courtroom be more reflective of the reality of society than the way it is right now. Because right now it seems like, the majority of the citizens of India are men, and there is just about, some 20% who are women, which is not the fact. We know that nearly 50% of the population of India is female or, other genders. We have, in this case that I was referring to, the state of MP versus Madan Lal, which was decided on July 30th, 2020, the Madhya Pradesh High Court imposed a condition for bail whereby the accused was directed to go to the complainant's house during Raksha Bandhan and ask her to tie a rakhi around his wrist with the promise to protect her to the best of his ability for all times to come. This woman had been raped by him. She was a rape survivor. And here is a judge of the High Court completely ignorant and insensitive of the trauma this woman has been through, that particular incident, and since. And telling this man he will get bail if he will go to her house on Raksha Bandhan. I mean, for those of you who are from North India, we in the South do not have a corresponding festival like Raksha Bandhan. But those of you who are from the North and who give so much of importance to Raksha Bandhan, to the sacrament of the relationship, the bond between a brother and sister, I don't know how you cannot be horrified by a judge asking the rapist, a man who has had sex, right, who has sexually forced himself upon a woman, to go and ask her to tie a rakhi on his wrist. Are we saying there are sexual relationships between brothers and sisters? I mean, what is this judge thinking? Besides the fact that you are asking the woman who has been traumatized by this man, who has sexually assaulted her, to go to her house and she should tie rakhi on his hand. And on that, if he were to do that, he would be granted bail for committing a heinous crime like this. Clearly, the court had absolutely no idea of the trauma suffered by her, and its condition and the condition that it imposed upon this man amounted to gross trivialization of the trauma she had suffered and was continuing to suffer. It is in that context that 9 women lawyers in Delhi filed a writ petition against the Madhya Pradesh High Court in the context of this totally insensitive judgment. And Attorney General K.K. Venugopal, who was speaking in this context, stated that objectifying women is a gross trivialization of the distress they have suffered, and there is a need to educate judges on gender sensitization. So it is not I who is asking for the gender sensitization of judges or judicial officers at every level. It was the Attorney General of India who made the statement in the Supreme Court in the context of this PIL that was filed by these 9 women lawyers against this July 30th, 2020 judgment of the Madhya Pradesh High Court. There are several such completely insensitive judgments which make a travesty of justice. In Mahmood Farooqi, the court said, a feeble no may mean yes. Seriously? I mean, this is why feminists have been saying that the law looks at women through the eyes of men. Because you have this myth in society that women say no when they mean yes. And therefore you can ignore the no. So when a woman says no, and she obviously will not say an assertive no for the simple reason of her socialization, right? A feminine quality is to be modest, is to be soft-spoken, is to be complying. Feminine quality isn't being aggressive, assertive. Those are masculine qualities. When you train your girls and women to possess these feminine qualities or to acquire these feminine qualities, how do you expect a woman who is being propositioned or who a man is wanting to have sex with, asks if she wants to have sex and she doesn't want, and she just utters a feeble no? If she wanted to have sex, are you saying the woman didn't have the capacity to say no or to say yes to it, right? And so in Mahmood Farooqi, you have another example of the way justice was made meaningless. Because the woman did not get justice, Mahmood Farooqi was acquitted. Because according to the court, a feeble no may mean yes. And in the more recent case, which just has been decided, we had the situation where just because the woman, the day after her rape, in the course of the work she had to fulfill, she had posed for a photograph, a formal official photograph, and smiled in that photograph. The judge arrives at the conclusion she could not have been raped, because the judge had certain expectations what a woman who has been raped will do, will look like. So in his imagination, a woman who has been raped will be, unkempt, her hair all over the place, wouldn't have taken bath, will be just crying and crying and crying and be hysterical. And instead, here was this woman cleaned up, posing in a photograph and even smiling. Now, if she had been raped, will she be smiling in a photograph? And therefore, he was acquitted. Right? So these examples of the kind of justice that we see being rendered through the courts in different courts at different times lets us know that there is a need for sensitization of judges. You have the other example of the former Chief Justice of India, Justice Bobde, who on March 1st, 2021, leading the bench, told the counsel appearing for Mohit Subhash Chavan, a government servant from Maharashtra, who was accused of repeatedly raping a young girl. Justice Bobde told him, "You should have thought before seducing and raping the young girl. You knew you're a government servant. If you marry her, we can help. If you don't, you lose your job and go to jail." I am just completely dumbstruck. Would you tell a man who has been stabbed repeatedly by an assailant, and tell that assailant, "Look, you should have thought about it before you stabbed the man. Now you stabbed him, but if you will become friends with him, then we will grant you bail. But if you will not become friends with him, you'll have to go to jail and you will lose your job." Do you ever tell a man that? But repeatedly in rape cases, the accused is let off, released on bail, if he promises to marry the woman or the girl that he has sexually assaulted. What kind of justice is that? It tells you how insensitive is the judiciary when it comes to the matters of gender justice. It is in this context that senior advocate Indira Jaising said, "We need a gender audit of the courts. We need to clean up the language of gender bias and replace it with the language of rights of women, to the autonomy of decision-making and the right to non-discrimination based on law. This will mean holding perpetrators accountable for their crime, not tying Rakhis around their victims." Another senior lawyer, Vrinda Grover, said, "The suggestions made by the Attorney General are very significant and need to be adopted. After all, gender justice is inherent in the constitutional principles of equality and non-discrimination. An orientation towards viewing women as equal citizens entitled to all freedoms and rights should be a mandatory, non-negotiable for all judicial officers. The Supreme Court, in its judgment in this case, suggested that gender sensitization training should be imparted to judges and public prosecutors. They also observed that each high court should formulate a module on gender sensitivity to sexual offenses to be tested in the judicial services exam. It also directed the Bar Council of India to take steps to include such courses in LLB and AIBE syllabus. Attorney General K.K. Venugopal said, lack of education, training, and a low number of women judges are responsible for the biased orders that make women marry their rapists or tie a rakhi, even though the law clearly states the victim must be protected from any contact and harassment by the accused. This is not to say that there have been no judicial decisions which have been gender sensitive. The best example till date that I can share of a gender sensitive judgment is in Sarita versus Venkata Subbaya, the High Court of Andhra Pradesh. This was in 1983. This was a case of restitution of conjugal rights. Under Section 9 of the Hindu Marriage Act, as most of you may know, it provides for the remedy of restitution of conjugal rights, and this has been repeatedly challenged as violating Article 14. In this particular case, which came up before the Andhra Pradesh High Court, the court noted that Section 9 did not discriminate between husband and wife on face value, insofar as the remedy of restitution of conjugal rights is equally available to both wife and husband. And thus, it seems to apparently satisfy the equality test. But the court turned its attention to the operation of such a remedy, right? So on the face of it, the law is not unjust. It's treating the wife and husband as equals. But when you look at the implementation of that remedy, what is the consequence? Is there still gender justice? The court said, in our social reality, this matrimonial remedy is found used almost exclusively by the husband and is rarely resorted to by the wife. The reason for this mainly lies in the fact of the differences between the men and the women. By enforcing a decree for restitution of conjugal rights, the life pattern of the wife is likely to be altered irretrievably, whereas the husbands can remain almost as it was before. This is so because it is the wife who has to beget and bear the child. This is practical, but the inevitable consequence of the enforcement of this remedy cripples the wife's future plans of life and prevents her from using this self-destructive remedy. Thus, the use of the remedy of restitution of conjugal right in reality becomes partial and one-sided and available only to the husband. So that's the reason why he said that on the face of it, it seems to meet the equality test. But in reality, it is partial, one-sided, and available only to the husband. He went on to say that as a result, this remedy works in practice only as an engine of oppression to be operated by the husband for the benefit of the husband against the wife. By treating the wife and husband who are inherently unequal as equals, Section 9 of the Act offends the rule of equal protection of the law. For that reason, the formal equality that Section 9 of the Act ensures cannot be accepted as constitutional. That, for you, my dear friends, is an example of a gender-sensitive judge. He's not a woman, he was a man. And yet, he could put himself in the shoes of the woman before him and look at the consequences of ruling in favor of the husband in this case of restitution of conjugal rights. He looked at what would happen to the woman if he granted restitution of conjugal rights. He said, you have to remember that the dilemma is to recognize the impact of child rearing on women. I mean, not only did he realize that, she will give birth to the child, and so for those 9 months, her life is going to be disrupted, but he also foresaw that she will have to bear the burden of bringing up the child. He recognized that. He recognized the impact of the law. That is important if we want to see justice is done. It's not simply seeing the word of the law. The spirit of the law is what is important. Right? Like Justice Krishna has said, he'd much rather give justice going beyond the law than to administer an unjust law which results in injustice. If this judge in the Sarita case was to have ruled according to the law, the impact of that decision on Sarita would have been lifelong. Sarita, incidentally, was a film actress in South India at that point in time. And you can imagine what would have happened to her career if he had granted restitution of conjugal rights. Unfortunately, of course, that is one example, but there are numerous examples which are to the contrary. Because soon after this judgment, you have the Harvinder Kaur versus Harmandir Singh Chowdhury case in the Delhi High Court, which rejected this challenge to the equality clause and noted that while Sarita was based on the assertion that suit for restitution by the wife is rare, this is before the enactment of the Hindu Marriage Act. And they said there is complete equality of the sexes here and equal protection of the laws. Clearly, they were not at all consonant with the reality of India. And they went even further in rejecting the challenge. They further said that the Constitution ought not to be applied to the family. So the Constitution, as soon as you enter your house, no Constitution. There can be inequality, injustice, discrimination, and everything can happen within the home. The Constitution is only till your doorstep, according to the Delhi High Court in 1984 in Harvinder Kaur versus Harmandir Singh Chowdhury. They said introduction of constitutional law in the home is most inappropriate. It is like introducing a bull in a china shop. It will prove to be a ruthless destroyer of the marriage institution and all that it stands for. In the privacy of the home and the married life, neither Article 21 nor Article 14 have any place. In other words, you can kill anybody you want within the home because Article 21 isn't guaranteed to anybody within the home, according to the esteemed judges of the Delhi High Court in 1984. How can anybody say something so contrary to the Constitution? But this is simply because, as Justice Krishna Iyer and others have said before, the judiciary, judicial officers come from the same society in which the survivors and the accused are. A society which is completely unequal. In law, all of us are equals, but in fact, there is no equality. We have discrimination on the basis of gender, caste, class, religion, and a whole bunch of other things. And gender is the most prominent of it, right? And in that context, when we look at the constitutional values, the standards set up by our Constitution, you cannot have anything contrary to it. But the reality is that our society is so new to these values of equality and right to life and justice that we are unable to think about equality between a husband and wife, equality between parents and children, equality between people of different castes and community and classes. And therefore, you have this division being made of, public and private, and family being put in the realms of the private space. But does the law really not get into the private space? Fact is that the law did, right? Till recently, it was completely right for police, judiciary, and the law to enter the bedroom of consenting adults to harass and punish same-sex partners. So clearly there is no public-private divide when it comes to matters that are seen as wrong from the perspective of the dominant in society. But the moment we talk about protection of the rights of those who are oppressed within the home, then immediately the wall of privacy comes up. Now, besides this particular, the Sarita case, where we see gender sensitivity, you have another important case which is often quoted by feminists, usually to point out the problems with that case. But I would like to look at some of the very good reasoning that was done in that case. Of course, it ended up, doing something wrong. But the reasoning that was provided, which shows that the judge who ruled in that case did have that understanding of society, and yet in spite of it, because of the lack of understanding of the depth of the trauma that rape can cause to a girl child, he went on to reduce a sentence of the accused. So in this judgment, this is the case, Bharwada Bhogin Bhai, Hirji Bhai versus State of Gujarat, 1977. In this particular judgment, the judges were A.P. Sen and M.P. Thakur. M.P. Thakur, who wrote the judgment, says, the need of the hour is to mold and evolve the law so as to make it more sensitive and responsive to the demands of the time in order to resolve the basic problem, whether, when, and to what extent corroboration to the testimony of a victim of rape is essential to establish the charge. Now, this particular case was about two young girls in the age of 10 or 12 who were raped by the father of their friend who was a neighbor. They had gone to the house thinking that, his daughter was there. He pretended she was there. He invited them in, then locked up the door, undressed himself in their presence, and exposed himself. And he asked them, to do things to him. So the second witness, she started crying and she managed to escape from there, while the first one was pushed onto the bed and made to undress. And the accusation was of rape. Now, she was in distress and was weeping when she went out, but her parents were not there at that time in her house. They returned only after 4 or 5 days. People in the neighborhood got to know about this, and they surrounded the house and demanded the man apologize. He, of course, refused to apologize. And therefore, then when the parents came, they went and filed the FIR, and he was found guilty by the Sessions Court as well as the High Court. They accepted the evidence, and they concluded that the appellant was guilty of sexual misbehavior with both the prosecution's witness 1 and 2, as alleged by the prosecution. And their evidence was affirmed by the High Court as well. Now, he had appealed against this in the Supreme Court, arguing that there was inconsistencies in the witnesses of the two young girls, etc. This was all, of course, the days before the POCSO Act had been passed by Parliament. Otherwise, the consequences could have been much more severe, because you're talking about raping two young girls in the ages of 10 to 12. Now, the court in this, talks about why, the High Court had accepted whatever had been established by the Sessions Court. They said, by and large, a witness cannot be expected to possess a photographic memory and to recall the details of an incident. It is not as if a videotape is replayed on the mental screen. To me, these observations of Justice Thakur are extremely important, because it shows his sensitivity, his being practical and understanding, and therefore making these allowances, which are very, very crucial, because there are many cases of rape which are there before courts, and where the survivor of the rape is humiliated, traumatized through the totally unnecessary questions that are put to the survivor. In fact, Justice Anand, the former Chief Justice of India, in an article has very clearly stated that there are provisions in the law which enable a judge to prevent such questions being asked. All right, I'll come to that a little later. But just for the observations of Justice Thakur, which shows you a judge can be sensitive, a judge can be practical, a judge can be reasonable, not male rationality, reasonable from the point of view of the lived experiences of girls and women who are subjected to sexual assault. Right? So the second point he makes is that ordinarily, it so happens that a witness is overtaken by events. The witness could not have anticipated the occurrence, which so often has an element of surprise. The mental faculties, therefore, cannot be expected to be attuned to absorb the details, because in the course of cross-examination, the questions put to a prosecutrix are, what was the color of his shirt? Was he wearing a full pant or a short pant? What color are his eyes? How is his hair? I mean, when you're being sexually assaulted, are you admiring your assaulter, or are you wondering whether you're going to survive this or not? And Justice Thakur here is so clearly aware that, a person who has been subjected to that kind of trauma is not going to be absorbing the details. He goes on to say again, the powers of observation differ from person to person. What one may notice, another may not. An object of movement might emboss its image on one person's mind, whereas it might go unnoticed on the part of another. By and large, people cannot accurately recall a conversation and reproduce the very words used by them or heard by them. They can only recall the main purport of the conversation. He said, it is unrealistic to expect a witness to be a human tape recorder. Then, with regard to exact time of an incident or the time duration of an occurrence, he says, people make their estimates by guesswork on the spur of the moment at the time of interrogation. And one cannot expect people to make very precise or reliable estimates in such matters. Again, it depends on the time sense of individuals, which varies from person to person. He says, ordinarily, a witness cannot be expected to recall accurately the sequence of events which take place in rapid succession or in a short time span. A witness is liable to get confused or mixed up when interrogated later on. And the most important point that he makes is, a witness, though wholly truthful, is liable to be overawed by the court atmosphere and the piercing cross-examination made by counsel, and out of nervousness, mix up facts, get confused regarding sequence of events, or fill up details from imagination on the spur of the moment. He said, the subconscious mind of the witness sometimes so operates on account of fear of looking foolish or being disbelieved, though the witness is giving a truthful and honest account of the occurrence witnessed by her. Perhaps it is a sort of psychological defense mechanism activated on the spur of the moment. And then lastly, he says, discrepancies which do not go to the root of the matter and shake the basic version of the witnesses cannot be annexed with undue importance. More so when the all-important probabilities factor echoes in favor of the version narrated by the witnesses. Now, this was a fantastic reasoning. But unfortunately, after that, he goes off into discussion about how Indian women are like that, Western women are like that. You know, as judicial officers, like historians, we must interpret facts. When we don't know facts, we need to leave it alone. Because he goes on to talk about how, you know, the Western woman may be a gold digger, she may be suffering from psychological neurosis and fantasizing or imagining a situation where she is desired, wanted, chased by males. Whereas the Indian woman, he says, like as if all Indian women are all Sati Savitris and they're all angels, will not lie, will not cheat, will not do wrong. You know, this categorization is the reason why this decision is often cited. But I chose to focus upon the reasoning that Justice Tucker provided here for why you do not need corroboration and why you need to overlook minor discrepancies in the testimony of the witnesses in a rape case. For me, that was more important than this irrelevant reasoning he went on to. That is what happens sometimes when we are verbose. You know, when we talk too much, we end up saying things we ought not to be saying or what we will regret later. Instead of that, he went into this entire thing, saying how in Indian society, a girl or a woman tradition, in a non-permissive society, will not lie, she'll be conscious of being ostracized, you know, she will face the risk of losing love and respect of husband and will not be married, etc., which are all stereotypes based upon stereotype of, you know, the good woman and the stereotype of the bad woman. Here, of course, all Indian women are good women and all Western women are bad women. That is how he went on to do it. And then ended up saying that this poor chap, right, who had done this, he himself uses the word, shockingly indecent manner he behaved, yet he says, we would have to be lenient in sentencing because this incident happened 7 years ago. The appeal was dismissed in 1976. 6.5 years have lapsed since then. And if we send him back to the jail after 6.5 years, when he has already suffered great humiliation in the society, prospects of his daughter finding a suitable match has been ruined, the stigma is still attached to him, etc. Therefore, looking at the cumulative effect of these circumstances for committing rape on one girl and exposing himself indecently to another girl, this court awarded only 15 months rigorous imprisonment with fine, and in default of fine, additional months of imprisonment. So there is an example of a judicial officer who was practical, used practical reasoning, as a feminist would ask for, and yet complete injustice done to the survivors of that sexual assault. Because the man got just 15 months imprisonment, 1 year and 3 months, for traumatizing 2 young girls. Because for those who are survivors of child sexual abuse, you know that it is a lifelong trauma. It affects your relationships with others. It affects your behavior with men. It has shattered your faith and trust in adult human beings. And you don't even get the satisfaction of seeing that the person who did that to you is punished, at least similarly, if not exactly. This is, of course, you have numerous such cases that are there, and which is why I said, it is not necessary that just because you have a woman judge on the bench, automatically they would be gender sensitive, because one of the cases which went before the first woman judge of the Supreme Court, Justice Fatima Bibi, was similarly decided. After 15 years, the man was, let go scot-free, because 15 years have lapsed. He has become a respectable member of society. He is a doctor. He's got a family. What about that young girl who 15 years ago, without any doubt, had walked into that home to meet her friend and instead was sexually assaulted by a man who was in his 20s? So she had to live with that, whereas the man, of course, everything was back to normal for him. Now, the miscarriage of justice in the context of women is not only in the cases of criminal law. You have succession laws, right? Where you find that courts have ruled that it is okay to disinherit daughters. For example, in Kaur Singh versus Jaggar Singh, 1961, under Section 14 of the Hindu Succession Act, 1956, which provides a female Hindu with the right of absolute ownership over her property, was challenged as discriminatory. Now, the court acknowledged that the act did create an apparent anomaly in the powers of alienation of property. It held that the removal of such remained prerogative of the legislature, etc. But it said it may well be that in view of the inferior status enjoyed by females, the legislature thought fit to put the females on a higher pedestal. It held that women as a class were different from men as a class, and the legislature had merely removed the disability attaching to women. Now, similarly, in Pratap Singh versus Union of India, the court went on to say that this special provision that was there was intended to benefit and protect women who have been traditionally discriminated against in terms of access to property, and it was not open to Hindu males to challenge the provision as hostile discrimination. Now, these are all what Professor Ratna Kapoor describes as a corrective approach. The idea that women have been historically discriminated against, and therefore we require special provisions to correct this discrimination. Now here, when the court is referring to the traditional problems that women faced in property ownership, it clearly is talking about such a corrective approach, right? Because what Professor Ratna Kapoor argues is that, generally speaking, the judicial approach to sex discrimination has been of 3 kinds. One, the most common approach is a protectionist approach, where women are constructed as weak and subordinate, and therefore in need of protection. And here the court then looks at women's differences as justification for giving them the differential treatment. And here they do not at all go into the question of why are there differences between women and men, nor into the substantive consideration of what will be the impact of such differential treatment on women. what they do through this protectionist approach is that in the name of protecting women, the court ends up reinforcing the subordinate status of women. Now, the second approach that the Indian Supreme Court has used is what is called the equal treatment or sameness approach, in which women are constructed the same as men, and therefore they ought to be treated exactly as men are treated in law. Now, this has been used to strike down provisions that treat men and women differently. This approach has also been used to remove any analysis of the potentially disparate impact of gender-neutral legislation. And according to this approach, it is enough that women and men are treated formally equally. Now, of course, there are feminists who do endorse such a viewpoint, saying that gender difference should be irrelevant and women must be treated exactly the same as men. But the problem is, women are not the same as men, not biologically in terms of their biological function, not socially, because socially men are treated as superior to women because we live in a patriarchal, male-dominated society, not economically because women do not have equal access to resources or in possession of such resources, not politically because we don't even have 25% women in any of the elected bodies other than the panchayats and other local bodies. So when women are not the same as men, women are not situated the same as men, to use the sameness approach is extremely problematic if we are seeking to implement justice. Therefore, any admission of differences between women and men and any attempt to accommodate those differences is used as a justification for continuing unequal and discriminatory treatment. For example, gender difference was used in the past for prohibiting women from voting, from being elected to government, from being admitted to the legal profession, and other such, economic, political, and cultural dimensions of society. Even today, that is why when we use a sameness approach, and we have this rule in some of the states where if you have more than 2 children, you are barred from contesting for elections. Now, this adversely impacts women for the simple reason that the woman isn't making that decision, whether to have 1 child, 2 children, or many children. She doesn't even have the right to decide, what is the spacing between children. And in such a context, when we implement this, so seemingly gender-neutral law, which prevents people with more than 2 children from contesting, we are adversely impacting women who have had no say in that process. Now, the third approach that our courts have used, but very sparingly, is what is described by Professor Ratna Kapoor as the most promising approach, namely the corrective approach, where you realize that women require special treatment because of past discrimination. And within this corrective approach, gender difference is often seen as relevant and as requiring recognition in law. It is argued that a failure to take difference into account will only serve to reinforce and perpetuate the difference and the underlying inequalities. This is extremely important because this is the means by which one can ensure justice through the courts, and more importantly, ensure that equality in reality is established. Nordin Taub argued, rules formulated in a male-oriented society reflect male needs, male concerns, and male experience. And therefore, the extreme and persistent economic and social inequality of women, which is a result of society's bias and oppression, is obscured by a definition of equality that focuses only on differences in the form of law. Because if you look at statistics, women are poorer than men. They work in ill-paid female jobs. They are the primary caregivers for their children, in-laws, and parents. And overwhelmingly, they are survivors of rape and violence within the home. So simple gender neutrality in law based on male standards does not address these inequalities which exist in society. So you need to recognize gender differences because the extent to which it has historically been the basis for disadvantage and discrimination, if we don't acknowledge it, then we perpetuate the inequality. The frustration that many of us have with the Constitution is that it guarantees such wonderful things. But 70 years since the Constitution, we still are talking about the need for gender equality and gender justice because the courts have failed us by not implementing gender justice using the corrective approach, ensuring substantive equality and not merely formal equality. We have seen the use of the protectionist approach more often. Judges are comfortable in categorizing women as weak, as helpless, as needing protection, and in that context, going on to provide, protection. So you have cases which might seem like, they have done gender justice, when in reality, through the reasoning provided in those judgments, what the judges have done is to reiterate the subordinate position of women, to reinforce the stereotype of the weak woman needing protection, needing care, and needing the help of men to be rescued. This is, oftentimes like, the Hindi film movies, right? Where, I mean, at least maybe not in your generation, but, when I was a youngster like you, so which is about, 30, 40 years ago, you would have a scene where a woman is being chased by a villain and, she's about to be raped. Then suddenly you'll have the hero land up and rescue her. In the meantime, she could have actually rescued herself by using any number of implements and tools in that surrounding, or even her own, right? Because women who conform to these patriarchal norms end up having long nails and all that, but they never use any of these. They wait to be rescued. Now, that stereotype that the Hindi movies propagated is more or less the kind of stereotype that our courts have been propagating in constructing the woman as weak and in need of protection. And therefore, trying to get her justice through various decisions. But the fact is that what they have done is reinforce the stereotype of inequality and subordination rather than empowering women to be able to stand up for themselves and encouraging men to respect women as equals, as human beings, as citizens with rights over their bodies. So the other context of problem when we have, so the C.B. Muttama case, which Justice Banwal Singh had just, referred to during his introduction to Justice Krishna Iyer, is a classic example of a case where you have the court striking down the restriction on women's employment, right? But look at the reasoning that was provided there. They said, if a woman member shall obtain the permission of government before she marries, the same risk is run by government if a male member contracts a marriage. If the family and domestic commitments of a woman member of the service is unlikely to come in the way of efficient discharge of duties, a similar situation may well arise in the case of a male member. In these days of nuclear families, intercontinental marriages, and unconventional behavior, one fails to understand the naked bias against the gentler of the species. So he did do justice by not using the protectionist approach. You have the case of the formal approach to equality, the sameness approach that was used in the context of Air India versus Nargis Mirza. In this case, air hostesses challenged the discriminatory employment conditions which were there for air hostesses and stewards. So air hostesses were expected to retire within the first 4 years of a marriage, and especially, of course, if they became pregnant. Right? So the Supreme Court upheld this contractual condition, permitting the termination of an air hostess service on her marriage within the first 4 years. The only thing it invalidated was a condition that terminated her service on her first pregnancy. And the court argued that it was reasonable classification under Article 14, and it set out the criteria for determining the distinct classes. It said air hostesses constitute a separate class of Air India employees. And therefore, this challenge to the restriction on marriage was upheld on the grounds that it fostered the state family planning program, and women would be more mature to handle and make a marriage work successfully if forced to wait for 4 years, as well as the grounds of financial hardship corporation would incur should the bar to marriage be removed. So they concluded treatment of the fair sex in this regulation is not arbitrary nor unreasonable. Whereas Stewart, was not removed from service after 4 years of his marriage. Here, the Supreme Court held it. Using the sameness approach, making reasonable classification, it upheld that it is perfectly reasonable to allow women to work for 4 years after their marriage and then to quit. Because that would ensure that they were following the family planning policy of the government of India by postponing their weddings, postponing their pregnancies. So these are just some of the examples that we see of the failure to have gender sensitivity, which can result in miscarriage of justice and failure to ensure that justice is done for everyone, irrespective of their gender, as per our constitution. Now, just to give an example of what can happen if a judge were to be gender sensitive, if a judge were to acknowledge the fact that I don't know enough about this and I need to learn about it, because one of the unfortunate things that we see oftentimes is that judges do not recognize the fact that they are fallible, that their knowledge is limited. They're not experts in everything. Like me, I cannot possibly talk about labor law, service law, or intellectual property rights law. I have absolutely no training in any of them. While I did study labor law, I never practiced labor law. I never have had to teach labor law. So any knowledge I might possess is a vague memory at the back of my mind. Intellectual property rights, I never studied it at all in the course of my undergraduate studies. And since I didn't have to teach it, I never bothered to read it. My expertise is limited to the subject of discipline of history, to feminist jurisprudence, to laws, to constitutional law, to family law, to criminal law. And this is true of all our judges. None of us can be masters of everything, for the simple reason that the world is continuously evolving, growing. There is so much new things happening, and we all have a limited period of time during which we learn and we study. Now, when we recognize these limitations, then we turn to experts in those fields to provide us the information to take informed decisions. Otherwise, through our ignorance, we can end up doing injustice in place of justice, which is the object of law, I assume. So I want to give you here an example, before I conclude my presentation for today, for this lecture, by referring to Justice N. Anand Venkatesh of the Madras High Court. I bow down to his humility and his modesty, as a consequence of which this judge went on to, just the day before yesterday, give us an important judicial decision. Now, this was a case of S. Sushma versus Commissioner of Police. In this particular case, Justice N. Anand Venkatesh was forced to deal with the issues of homosexuality, of the LGBTQIA+ community. And he frankly stated, I have no hesitation in accepting that I too belong to the majority of commoners who are yet to comprehend homosexuality. Ignorance is no justification for normalizing any form of discrimination. I think that is profound. He acknowledges that I am in this majority of people who do not comprehend homosexuality. I don't know what is this thing. I don't know who are these people. I only knew the male gender, the female gender. I only knew about sex between men and women. But now when I have a case here before me of different kinds of sexualities, I'm not going to dismiss it off by saying this is against my morality or the morality of this country, or this is against our culture. No, he says ignorance is no justification for normalizing any form of discrimination. You know what Justice N. Anand Venkatesh did? before he gave this judgment, he spent days together undergoing psychoeducation, interacting with a transgender doctor and her mother before writing out his judgment. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is key to ending our, biases, our prejudices. You don't know, about women. You do not end up saying, oh, women are from Venus, men are from Mars. They're not human beings. Who understands women? What do women want? That is all ridiculousness or ridiculous ways of justifying ignorance. You don't know enough about women, then go and learn about women. Undergo sensitization, mandatory sensitization, so that you understand who are women, what are they? That is what Justice Anand did. Anand Venkatesh did. He didn't know about homosexuality. He didn't know about the LGBTQIA+ community. So he went through psychoeducation sessions. And having been informed, he then ruled that doctors should be forbidden from performing surgeries or giving shock treatment, etc., to people to force them, from their homosexual tendencies. He also called for gender sensitization for all stakeholders, the police, prison people, as well as the judiciary and educational institutions. Dear friends, I end my lecture today in memory of Justice Krishna Iyer by stating that gender sensitization is extremely important if we want to have justice, not just gender justice. Gender justice is part of social justice. Without gender justice, there is no social justice. But in order to ensure that justice, as promised in our Constitution, is implemented and made a reality for all genders, it is important that all judicial officers undergo mandatory gender sensitization programs in their course of their judicial training. Thank you very much once again, Professor Bhavesh Gupta, for giving me this opportunity to deliver this lecture in memory of the esteemed Justice Krishna Iyer.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for joining us, for delivering such a powerful and knowledgeable address. As faculty members and students, we all have learned so much from it. I also thank all the dignitaries who are present here. And with this, we conclude the lecture for today. Thank you very much. So I'm ending the meeting for all. Thank you.